I'm here with Nico of Kardashev to talk about Liminal Rite, out right now on Metal Blade Records. And the man himself is here with me with a hat that requires no introduction. Not you, the hat. The hat requires.
Oh, I get it. Look at this hat, baby. Woo! Yeah.
You guys have to find a way of adding that to your merch somehow.
Oh,
Put like a Kardashev logo in the back or something. I don't know. Find a way, because that shit would sell like hotcakes at the merch stand.
yeah, I think you're right. A lot of people give me compliments about it.
It brings everybody to the yard. It's better than a milkshake.
Oh my gosh. It's kind of the deathcore or death metal equivalent of a milkshake, I suppose.
Yes, it is. All right, so let's talk about the record.
Okay.
And I want to start off, we have to. That's kind of why we're here. I mean, I could talk about your hat for like 2 hours, but let's talk about the record. And let's start off with the concept behind this album. Can you elaborate a little bit on what drove the inspiration to the album, to the concept, to how everything kind of came together?
Absolutely. Originally, when we were writing this record, we didn't have a concept. We just knew we needed to write a full-length record and deliver it to Metal Blade, and we would have that relationship going. So we had written about 3 songs worth of composition, none in particular in this order, but just 3. And Mark says to me, I've been kind of like finding myself interested in the idea of like innocuous possessions that people own and how we take them for granted. As an example, a water bottle. We take this for granted because we just know it exists. But there's something valuable and maybe even beautiful to a degree about how it just does its function and we can depend on it. So we started exploring this sort of like abstract idea of the value of everyday objects. And then eventually that turned into, how can we explore a character having this idea that these objects are important? And so we created this character, the Lost Man, who you see on the cover of the record. And then it became less about the objects and their importance, and now it was about his memories associated with specific objects. And this is something that we see in real life all the time. Somebody like me, who loves old video games, Mario as an example, we can find ourselves in a state of nostalgia a lot when we go to like revisit these old things. But that's not always healthy. Some people do that to a detrimental degree. They hold on to possessions in an emotional way that doesn't really seem logical. And so there can be an unhealthy relationship with the past and the things that are in our lives. And that was the reason that we wanted to write the record about this old man with dementia and this unhealthy relationship with these objects in his life. So that was the idea.
Do you think, going into a more philosophical standpoint here, do you think when you hold on to things that are in your past, eventually your mind starts to recreate what those memories are, and they become a little bit detached from the actual reality of what they were?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not a doctor or psychologist or anything, but I would say that in my personal experience, I have seen people who have a detrimental relationship with things that they seemingly put more value on for how it existed in their past life. Like you see a lot of people now buying these new retro consoles, like retro SNES or N64, and they revisit the game, but it's not the same game as it's what's in here. Your memory holds a different version of it. And so that can kind of break that relationship that you have with that ideal. But I think it is rosy colored. I do.
Yeah, I have that issue with TV shows that I watched when I was a kid that I absolutely loved. And now that I have the financial means to go back and purchase them or reacquire them, whatever you want to put it, and watch them, and I'm like, well, this is not exactly how I remember it. It had a different, I don't know, it did something different at that point. And I realized that it's a lot less to do with the object itself, but more to with the time frame in which the object was experienced. That is a snapshot in time that you can never recreate. And I think we have this illusion that we can recreate it, but I don't think we can really go there.
Yeah, I think you're right. And just to kind of follow that up, there's probably like a metaphysical sort of scientific perspective in this, and that is quantum physics, where just the sheer observation of a thing changes it. And so when you're young and you're experiencing a thing for the first time, like say a video game, and it has its effect on you, but you have your effect on it, like you interpret it a certain way. So then to go back to it 10, 15, 20 years later, thinking it's going to be the same experience is really setting yourself up for failure, because you're going to have a different set of experiences telling you what this game is. So I agree with you.
Yeah, and you've evolved as a person. The emotional baggage that you had at that point in time is completely different from the emotional baggage that you have today. And that to me is what sets everything apart, because you're not the same person. The object is exactly the same, but you're not. And that is, you're never going to have that same equivalent.
Dude, you're so right. You said it better than I could have. I agree 100%.
So now you guys had this idea.
Yeah.
How do you transfer then this idea, which is a great idea, but to me, if I'm in the room with you guys, I'm like, oh, you call me when you know exactly where we're going with this. So
Yeah.
how do you transfer this idea to actual music that you can put on a record?
This is a good question, because I'm not responsible for that process for the same reason that you would be like, yeah, just call me when you figure it out. I'm kind of removed. Mark is a genius in this way. He's done this with every single record, but he's got a process. And that process is actually kind of simple. He listens to the music that I write, or we write in this case, that we write. And he tries to really focus in on the emotional value that the music is trying to instill upon him. And then he decides, what is it trying to say? And then how can I compound the value of that emotion? And so with this record, or at least the 3 songs that I gave him originally when he was trying to figure it out, he listens to it, and to him, it felt like being stuck in the past. It felt like memories, but not necessarily good or bad. They were just memories. And then questioning if they were good or bad memories made him think, well, what if I'm misremembering a bad memory as a good one because I'm blocking out the bad? And then he started getting into this like psychological, philosophical sort of angle with it. And eventually he said, what if we talk about this? And that's kind of how it began. But for me, I just write the music, and I hope that it has emotional value for him to then pull out of. So.
And how do you guys find the balance between working on songs? Because I thought this album, of all the records that you guys have worked on, of all the songs you guys have worked on, I felt like this album, one of the things that sets it apart is that I'm able to listen to the songs on the individual basis and get what the songs are about. And then I can listen to the album from start to finish and be completely immersed in that journey. Not always is the case when it comes to a concept idea where you can remove the songs from the context of the album and still have them work. This album has that ability. You can come at it from different angles. How do you guys work on that? Do you think about what the big picture is going to be all about, or are you kind of just hoping that everything falls in place?
This is a good question. Lyrically, I actually hope it falls into place. That's where my like design stops and my hopes begin, because ultimately I'm not responsible for all of it. But when it comes to designing the idea of listening to the whole record as a single song or experience, I do that very intentionally. I try to find a way to make each song flow back to back to back with as little breaks as possible. And I think somebody else asked me this once. They said, hey, if you weren't writing a concept record, what would you be writing? And the only alternative I could come up with is, I guess, a bunch of like bangers, like Billboard 100. Maybe you put those together and that becomes an album. But to me, an album is more about a whole experience. So my job is to make it have dynamics and flow from start to finish as best I can. And then Mark takes my hopes and he's like, hey, I'm going to help you realize this vision. So that's kind of where I would describe it.
See, and that is an interesting process, because it's not all depending on you. It's not all depending on him. There's a little bit of collaboration. Do you guys work as a sounding board of one another?
We absolutely do. Yeah. So I have a couch back here. You can't see it right now, but it's right there. Mark will lay on his back on the couch, just listening to what I'm trying to create here at my studio. And he will give me real-time feedback. He'll say, that sucks, or, oh, that sounds like the theme song from Star Trek. And I'm like, damn it, and I'm trying to recreate whatever the idea is. But I do the same thing for him. We record him at his studio, and I will engineer for him. I'll say, okay, don't stress about recording, just stress about finding that emotional value. And so we kind of depend on one another in that regard. So that's part of it. But I do want to make a point here. We also have 2 other members in the band now who are full-time, and they are actually part of the group, and they have been since the Bearing of Shadows, and that's Sean and Alex. Sean and Alex both wrote a ton of this record. Alex is responsible for the narration and some of the lyrics, all of the bass work, most of the piano work, and some of the guitar work. Everybody here really reached beyond their wheelhouse to make this record come together. So I wanted to make sure that I said that.
So did everybody go a little bit outside of their comfort zone for this album?
Yes, 100%. The voice to you here. If for those of you listening on CD and digital, there's a narration part that doesn't exist on vinyl, unfortunately, but that's Sean's voice. He is the narrator of the record. He's also responsible for all the drums, but he also composed, which song is it? I think it's Cellar of Ghosts. He also composed that whole track. So we all reached beyond what our wheelhouse used to be to provide a bigger picture of this record. So it's pretty awesome.
Is that the biggest growth for you guys as a band coming into this album, that reaching outside of your comfort zone? Or when you look at the finished product of this record, is there something that stands out to you as perhaps some of the biggest growth that you've seen from the band from start to now?
That's a really good question. I think that, and I haven't really had to speak on this before, but while I'm thinking about it right now, I would say that this does understand that we can trust each other beyond that wheelhouse, right? I can trust Sean on a composition. I can trust Alex on piano. I can trust Mark to just be here with me and like be my auditor, my real-time sounding board. So there's a lot of trust that came from this, especially because with Metal Blade on board, we now have deadlines that we all are trying to agree on and abide by so that we can be a part of like the regular press machine and the press cycle and things like that. So in that regard, I think trust was one of the biggest things that came from this that I personally didn't feel in the past.
When I was listening to this album and I look at the press release, I know I normally don't look at the press release when I'm listening to a record. I don't want anything that the PR people say on a press release to influence how I perceive the album or what
Sure.
I think about the album. But a couple of songs in, I'm like, let me look at the press release just to see what they labeled you guys as, because there's always like, death metal, this, whatever. And I was like, I don't think you guys can fit in a genre. Like the sound on this album specifically, not that it was any different from before. You guys always had this ambiguity to it. It's really hard if you're explaining to a guy or to a girl who's never listened to Kardashev before about Kardashev's music, specifically on this album. How do you even start to describe it?
Yeah, I think if I had an elevator pitch for our sound, I would start with pretty death metal. I would say like beautiful death metal. I would try to like make their brain like grasp the idea of that, right? And so for a lot of people, Cannibal Corpse is the defining tone for death metal, but then beautiful is very subjective. It's a very subjective idea. Like, am I talking about Enya? Is Enya beautiful to most people? Probably. Or am I thinking about like jewelry? Like diamonds are beautiful too. Like, what are we really getting at? So my elevator pitch would be beautiful death metal. But to people who are genre snobs like myself, I love delineating out genres and being like, that's not black metal, that's atmospheric black metal, right? I like thinking about it in that way. Although I'm not an opinionated elitist online. I promise. I would say that death gaze is that one thing that just logically makes sense if you really look at it beyond beautiful death metal.
I thought you were going to say Mario Kart death metal, but okay.
Bro, let's go. Covers inbound, dude.
Hey, the other day somebody threw a banana in my car. I'm telling you, if I had a couple of turtle shells, I would have fought back.
Oh, absolutely, dude. You don't stand up for that.
You mentioned death gaze. Let me ask you this: the sound on this album has some, I'm not going to say proggy elements, but there's some technical elements, maybe even some proggy elements in it that start to give a different kind of aroma to the sound of Kardashev. Is that something that, are you intrigued by that? Would you like to see more of that in the future being incorporated in the sound of the band?
Yeah, I think so. One thing that I really value about the guys that we've brought together to make Kardashev what it is currently is that we're all really on the same page. Like, we take influences from a lot of different spots. Mark listens to folk music. Alex listens to some of the most extreme metal you can actually find. I like listening to scores from movies. I love Hans Zimmer and the atmosphere that's created from orchestra. But then Sean listens to, hip hop and then everyday metal. And I mean, we have this nice variety between us. So those flavors that you're picking up on, those aromas, as you said, those I think are going to become more and more frequent in our music. That's going to continually move us away from the traditional sounds of death metal and start incorporating different types of textures.
One of the things I mentioned on my review is that I wanted to see a little bit more bass in the future. Will we get a little bit more bass in the future? Because you guys gave us a couple of slaps. But in those slaps were so good that I really felt that with the atmospheres that you guys create, incorporating a little bit more or giving a little bit more of a predominant role to the bass? Not on every track, obviously, otherwise it loses its allure, but in some of the songs, is that something that you would see doing as well?
Absolutely. Alex is fantastically talented. He not only plays bass for us, but he plays guitar for us and piano, and he helps write some prose for us, as I was describing. So he's highly talented. And I think what's going to come from this, going back to the trust discussion, is that I'm going to be able to depend on him to actually design the sound of a song, and then I can sit back and say, no, 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 we need you to be in the front of this particular song. A good example of this, I think, is Cellar of Ghosts off of the new record, where he's playing lines that almost feel pop punk in a way because they're so like moving and like optimistic or hopeful. So I think so. You'll see more of it in the future.
What was the toughest song on this record for you, or for the band in general, the one that you guys struggled with the most?
I would have to say that we would each pick a different song probably, but Cellar of Ghosts was the biggest challenge for me. And that's because Sean composed it. And the funny thing is, he composed it in a key that I'm not familiar with. So I had to really think outside the box to design the remaining elements of the song to make it feel like one whole composition. So he brought us these like germs of musical ideas. He said, "Hey, I composed this years ago. Do you guys think we can use it?" And from that, I built the whole song around it. But it was the biggest challenge because it wasn't my composition, it was his. And so I had to adapt to him, where normally I'm the one asking people around me to adapt to me. So it was just like a flipping the process on its head. So for me, that was it. Cellar of Ghosts.
It turned out amazing. So you guys did a phenomenal job.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, you guys definitely delivered on that one. When you look at the lyrical content, not just on this record, but the lyrical content that you guys dive into, what kind of role do you see that lyrical content play into the atmosphere that then the sound helps to define?
I think the role is very important. Not everybody is well versed in the language of music, but maybe they know the feeling that music gives them. And that's kind of where that's the lowest common denominator with music. But with lyrics, with language, with poetry to an extent, it can be relatable when you need it to be relatable. I heard a quote recently. I think it was Ethan Hawke was talking about the importance of art in culture, and he basically explained that a poem doesn't make sense to most people until they need that poem, until they recognize the message of that poem. And I think that the same thing is true with music. Like with our previous record, The Bearing of Shadows, the subject matter lyrically is very dark, and not many people can relate to, for instance, abandoning a child in the woods. That's not something that's very relatable on a language level, but the emotion that the music allows you to feel with the story of what it might be like to feel responsible for abandoning another human, those two married together paints a different picture. And so with Liminal Rite, we chose the idea of aging, nostalgia, and dementia as the three forms that would help the music feel relatable.
Wow, really interesting. One last question. I mean, talking to you, I'm opening the book on Kardashev. I'm learning a lot more
Yeah.
than it's incredible, because I feel like you
Oh,
guys
thanks.
are one of those bands. You guys are like an onion. You keep peeling layers, but there's always more layers underneath it. You see that in the music, and I'm seeing that just talking to you in terms of how you explain how everything comes together. But one last question for you: when will we see you guys on the road in support for this record?
That's a great question. As of right now, we have no plans to tour. The logistics and finances of it haven't actually worked out for us to this degree. So, to anybody listening and to all of your followers, which I very much appreciate your time, if you know somebody that can help us get on the road, send me a DM, send me a message, tag me. Let me see if I can make it happen.
Let's make this happen. I need to see you guys play live. Come
Me
on.
too. Me too, man.
There's a lot of shitty bands on the road these days. I'm not going to mention names, but there's a lot of shitty bands on the road these days. You guys need to find somehow your way into a tour package so that you can play your music to as many people as are willing to listen, because it's a phenomenal experience. But I feel like listening to you guys live could really even catapult that experience into a complete different level. So
I can only hope, and trust me, I'm a fan too. I want to know what we sound like live. I want to know too, because I'll probably be critical of it and think like we sound like shit like all the time. But I want that experience. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah, and you want to see people stage dive and people having a good time. So
Yeah.
I hope things change in the near future and you guys are added to a tour package and you guys hit the road and I get to see you guys play. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that. And I was going to say best of luck with this release, but I don't think you guys need any luck.
Oh,
When hard work gets into play, luck really, there's no room for luck. So you guys have a phenomenal album. One of the best albums I've heard this year, without a shadow of a doubt. It's just a phenomenal record from top to bottom. Maybe not a fast food style record that you can play in your drive to work. I think it's one of those albums you need to sit down and really enjoy the same way you would do a fine course meal. So
oof.
phenomenal job.
Well, thank you so much, Pedro. I appreciate your time and your love and your feedback. So thanks.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. All the best.
Thank you. You too.